Yeah. Somebody.
We're good. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this expert talk by Nina Jankowicz on online abuse and how to fight back. So right now, Nina is the vice president at the Center for Information Resilience, which is a think tank based in London. But she's done many other things, including write 2 books, one of which is my copy that I'm very excited for her to sign this afternoon, and another book called How to Lose the Information War, which is a book about Russian disinformation specifically. So she's also done a lot of research on gendered disinformation, a little bit of which with myself, which I'm very proud of. And at one point was appointed as a US government head of the Disinformation Governance Board, which led to a torrent of backlash, hate, and abuse, and the cancellation of the board itself that Nina will touch on a little bit, and kind of how it brought her. Actually, it came out the same week that the book was about receiving online abuse was published. So Nina will give us many more details and tidbits about that, and of course strategies on how to fight back against this horrible online harm. And Nina has a passion for safeguarding online spaces, particularly for women, from both Russian and hateful trolls alike. So very excited to hear her talk to all of us today. We'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Alexa. Thank you to Mark and Ellie for having me here at OII today, and thanks to all of you for coming out. I actually haven't had a lot of opportunities to do in-person book talks because my first book came out in July 2020, and then we were kind of at the end of the Omicron wave when this book came out. So I've only done a handful of them, and it's really nice to be in front of real live people, including, I have to shout out to Katie Beard here, who was in my high school debate club. Together when we were in high school. We were big nerds in Model Congress and Model UN. So this is like very much full circle. Katie is now an expert on Vikings and Norse mythology. Have I gotten that right? Yes. I don't know anything about it, but if you ever have questions about that, you can go to Katie. All right, let us begin. There we go. Okay, that's me. I thought I'd give you a little bit of a background about myself in addition to what Alexis told you. So I started my research in the Central and Eastern Europe region. I very much view kind of the problems of the internet through the lens of the struggles of the peoples of the post-Soviet region. So I did a lot of work in Russia and Belarus and kind of Poland, Ukraine, etc. Earlier in my career. And when Russian disinformation and fake news, although I hate to call it that, was becoming a thing, those countries were much more savvy than we were in the West at that time, back in 2014, 2015, 2016. And I worked in Ukraine in 2016 and 2017, which led to the publication of my first book. I wanted to kind of tell the story of how governments in Central and Eastern Europe were dealing with disinformation, and what the West could learn from them. And it was during that time that I first started thinking about gendered disinformation, because I kept running into women in opposition politics or activism who had been smeared, usually by the Kremlin, but also sometimes by misogynist movements in their home countries, with sexualized and gendered hate. So they were attempting to discredit these women with these narratives. And that's where I started first picking through the idea of gendered disinformation. So those are my first 2 books. I'll talk a little bit today about the Wilson Center study that Alexa referenced before, which we called malign creativity. We'll talk about what that means. But this looked at gendered disinformation in English-speaking contexts. But I've also done work in hostile online environments. So places like Russia, Ukraine, et cetera, where, you have to be a little bit cyber aware. So I hope there will be some things that you learn today as well. I think often in academia, and I kind of straddle a bunch of fields, but in academia, we have a little bit of a chip on our shoulders of like, who would be interested in my arcane research? And really, it's not even about your research, it's about your personal information. So if you walk away with one thing today, I hope that it's to really take these very basic precautions to safeguard yourself, safeguard your loved ones, safeguard your private information, because all of that can be used against you if one day you find yourself researching the next pandemic, or there's a Viking ship discovery that Katie finds and there's disinformation about it. I don't know. Anyway, so here we are, and we'll go through all of that today. As Alexa said, this has become extremely personal for me. So it was personal before all of this began and I published the book, I had experienced online abuse, but not to the scale that I did since this spring. So the very basic architecture of what happened was I got a political appointment in the Biden administration. I was tapped as an expert to lead a group that was going to be doing policy making around disinformation in the Department of Homeland Security. The way the government chose to communicate about that that effort, which was essentially just a coordination group within DHS. It had nothing to do with censorship or arbitrating truth. In fact, it didn't have that power. It couldn't have had that power, and I wouldn't have taken the job if it had anything to do with that. The way they chose to communicate about it was fairly opaque and led to a lot of interest in me personally, and also as a young woman. At the time, I was also 9 months pregnant. I was just like a perfect figure for everyone to tear apart. And the administration wouldn't let me respond to any of the attacks against me, which ranged from like ridiculous people making fun of TikTok videos I had made to like absolute lies and misconceptions and misinformation about things that I had said. And I would actually say deliberate disinformation. They knew that they were lying. And eventually I decided that none of this was worth it because the administration wasn't standing up for the work. They wouldn't let me stand up for myself. And my family was under threat at a time that was extremely vulnerable for me. I was literally weeks away from giving birth to my first child. And so I resigned the role. And what that has, although it has been really difficult, and I can talk a little bit about the things that I'm still dealing with as a result of all of that. In fact, yesterday we were just in Brussels at a conference, and I got a hate message during that live stream of the event that we were on, calling me Nazi shit and saying that my family was being watched and I never walked alone. So that was, it's the type of unsettling thing that I receive a lot. In addition to all of this, I mean, like my life has kind of been irrevocably changed, and it's allowed me to speak, as I have always been with my book and my research, about what it's like to be a woman online. And I know it seems kind of trite, like how to be a woman online, you just exist, right? But the reality is that we deal with a much higher level of abuse, a much different level of vitriol that men do, often dealing with, our reproductive status, our marital status, our looks. You can see the sort of things that people were saying about me. And this was just in the first couple of days after the board was announced. And again, it's continued for the past nearly 9 months now. So I'll talk a little bit more about it, but just to give you a taste, this is something I care very deeply about. And I think it's important to keep reminding people that it's not okay, it's not normal, and it's worth standing up to. So what we'll cover today, I know we're in an academic environment, so I thought I'd give a little outline. I want to give you some stats and kind of a deeper understanding of the research that Alexa and I have done, in addition to some of my other colleagues, to define and understand the problem. And then this is the basic architecture that the book follows. There's a lot of kind of meat in there and resources in there if you're interested in picking it up, but we'll talk through some basic digital security stuff that I think everybody should undertake. All of these things are kind of set it and forget it. Once you put them on your accounts, you won't have to think about it again, and you won't be at risk for, malign foreign actors trying to hack your stuff, or, people trying to get your personal information for credit card details or whatever. We'll talk about trolls and how to deal with them, and hopefully make it a little bit lighthearted, even though they're kind of icky. Platform policy, how to navigate your way around the platforms and make them work for you, because that's what they're meant to do, right? You are, sometimes they treat us like the product, but you're the user and they need you. So how do we navigate that and make sure that your online experience can be one that is safe, secure, and empowering, and then how to cultivate both community and tenacity, which can be pretty exhausting. I often say, I didn't ask to be resilient. I wish I didn't have to be resilient, but the reason that I do this is so that the women who come after me hopefully don't have to go through this. So that is where we're going today. All right, so 336,000. This is the amount of abuse that we found during a 2-month period in our Wilson Center study across 6 social media platforms, looking at just 13 female candidates for office. So this was 10 women who were running for various positions during the 2020 election cycle in the United States, and then 3 women in English-speaking contexts elsewhere. So we looked at Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, we looked at Krista Freeland in Canada, and Priti Patel here in the UK. And what we found across those 6 platforms, across women from different backgrounds, political parties, and ages, was that the thing that united them is that they all got online abuse. And almost all of them were affected by what we call gender disinformation as well. It was shared by 198,000 users, which I think is an important stat because it shows that people are doing this multiple times. It's not just, one and done. And from my experience, again, qualitative data, but still, we could probably download my Twitter archive at some point. We should do that. We should do that before the API goes away. This is people who come back again and again and again. And that's what makes it a little bit oppressive, right? It's different if it's just one person kind of saying snarky things to you, but it is a torrent. It's a torrent of people coming back multiple times. And we have a graph later on that will kind of show and illustrate this. As I said, I first started thinking about gender disinformation in 2017 when I was doing research in the Republic of Georgia and in Ukraine. And interestingly, 2017, year after the US election, we were talking a lot about disinformation at that point, and Russian disinformation in particular, but not talking about gender as a cleavage that Russia and other malign actors use in order to undermine democracies. We were talking about race, we were talking about, hot button political issues like gun control. But even with Hillary Clinton's failed candidacy for president and the gendered narratives that so much of both the mainstream media and then propaganda outlets like RT and Sputnik used against her, we weren't talking about gender. And I heard stories from Svetlana Zalishchuk, who's depicted in this lovely cartoon here. She was an MP in Ukrainian parliament, elected right after Euromaidan, so the revolution that brought the democratic government in Ukraine to power. Former activist and journalist. She was in her 30s when she was elected, very attractive, young, bright woman. And she was relentlessly attacked by Kremlin trolls who said that they created this absolutely absurd narrative, really not believable in any way. But the narrative was that if Ukraine lost a key battle early in the war, she was going to run naked down the main street of Kiev, Krishchatyk. It had no basis in reality. Ukraine lost that battle. And when that happened, she got this abuse saying, well, why aren't you running naked down the street? Why aren't you running naked down the street? And it might seem silly, but they took her face and superimposed it on naked women's bodies, sometimes in, pornographic and suggestive positions. They would even take people's genitalia and Photoshop it onto her face. And it was an extremely widespread kind of grotesque campaign, and had such an effect that she one time went to the United Nations to talk about the resilience of Ukrainian women, and a journalist from a European country that we shall not name today asked her about this campaign against her. Not as if like, oh, it's horrible what's happening to you. They asked, is this true? And so that was the first time I started thinking about this in a real kind of inquisitive way. And I started asking all of my interviewees as I was researching my first book if they had dealt with this. And I came across some other examples. In Georgia, which is both Ukraine and Georgia are pretty highly patriarchal societies, very traditional. In Georgia, a lot of politically active women had been targeted with a fake sex tape scandal. And in that context, some of them had to kind of retreat from public life altogether. Svetlana didn't do that. She remained an MP. She spoke out about what happened to her. But women in Georgia were tainted by this sex tape scandal, which kind of, again, undermined them, but also made them look immoral in the eyes of the general public. One woman that I interviewed was able to disprove that the sex tape was real because she has a tattoo on her back and the woman in the sex tape did not. But again, putting women in a really difficult position to be on the back foot all the time. And I think it's important to point out that these narratives wouldn't be successful from foreign actors if we didn't have endemic misogyny in our societies. Something that I always talk about and try to bring up, because we hear a lot about deep fakes all the time, is that, we can talk about deep fakes and regarding, nuclear threats and election interference. That's all well and good, but there's actually a deep fake problem that exists today. And that is that 95% of the deep fakes that are on the internet right now are non-consensual pornography trained on women's bodies. And so I often say, you know, all an adversary has to do to undermine a fearsome woman who is going toe to toe with them is create a deep fake of her. And nobody's going to stop to check, is this deep fake pornography or is this real pornography? And we know that once people see an image, whether it's a picture or a video, that's going to be seared in their minds. It's hard to correct that. And it really does undermine people for forever. So that's where this all started. I always put this in here because The Economist said that I coined the term gendered disinformation, and I'm not going to give that up ever. So I also wanted to take it a little bit broader and talk about some of the work that the Center for Information Resilience does. And if any of you are ever interested in doing some research with CIR, please do look me up. We'd be happy to talk about, you know, contracts or other types of research cooperation we could do. But we've got something called the Hypatia Project, which looks at gendered disinformation and abuse online in a bunch of different sectors and regions. We did some work in Afghanistan following the US withdrawal. And what we saw was, I mean, you can read this for yourself, but an immediate increase in gendered hate speech online after the US withdrawal and the takeover of the Taliban. We saw a lot of increases in hate speech anytime women are protesting. So I'm sure we're seeing a similar thing right now, although I don't have the data on it yet, but with women, you know, protesting against their exclusion from university there. We also just released a report on Myanmar looking at gendered hate speech there. And both in Afghanistan and Myanmar, I think they really illustrate the fact that this isn't just online. There is an online-offline continuum here. And in Myanmar, women are often doxxed, so their personal information is released. And once that information, their location, their address, their phone number is released, the authorities often come and arrest them. So for everybody who says to you that, you know, online abuse is just words, it's just hurt feelings, which is an argument that we've heard in UK Parliament actually about including gender in the online safety bill. This is, I would say, absolutely false. And not only is it discrediting women, it's putting their safety at risk, and combining it with the offline violence that we face, it's silencing women's participation. So I know that I approach my online presence very differently now after what I've endured. And I know that women I've talked to who I mentor often ask me, how do you deal with this? Like, I really don't want to have a public lifestyle. I don't want to be public in my research or my work. And I think that our democracies are all a lot weaker for that. All right, so what's the definition, right? I promised you some definitions. Gendered abuse is the broader umbrella that I think of all of this in. And there's a lot of terms for this. Sometimes you'll hear online gender-based violence, OGBV, or the new one is TFGBV, tech-facilitated gender-based violence, because it's not just about it being on the internet, it's that we see platforms facilitating and basically tacitly condoning this abuse, right? But for a layman, I prefer to just use gendered abuse. So this often casual use of derogatory terms aimed at degrading and insulting women based on their gender or their sexuality. And this can range from calling women things like a bimbo to sexually violent threats like rape and murder. And then we have the subset of this that is gendered and sexualized disinformation. And the study that Alexa was one of the co-authors on, the way that we define this was using false or misleading gender-based narratives against women, often with some degree of coordination. So either through mainstream media, through political parties, through activist networks, et cetera, that is aimed at deterring women from participating in the public sphere. So those are the three main characteristics that we see there. And I think it's important to point those out because often you'll see gender-based narratives that are political in some way. That might just kind of be political campaigning, but gendered disinformation campaigns are something quite specific, often interlocking and overlapping with gendered abuse, but it's a little bit different than kind of the political sniping that you might see during an election season, right? And what we found during our Wilson Center study, again, we had a really diverse variety of folks in those 13 targets of our study that we looked at, that gendered abuse and disinformation is compounded for people and women who have intersectional identities. So if they're gay or Black or South Asian or what have you, and also a woman, they're going to face way more abuse than their white counterparts. And so, for example, we looked at Kamala Harris. She accounted for 78% of the instances of online abuse and disinformation that we found during that study. And part of that, yes, is because she was, at the top of everyone's mind, voting for president and vice president, but also because she was a huge target. I mean, three identities that she had there, targeted by all three of these disinformation narratives. So sexualized, they were saying she slept her way to the top, and that's how she got her position. Racist or racialized, so either terrible racist stuff or racialized language, claiming she wasn't Black enough or South Asian enough to claim her heritage, or transphobic in nature. And this is an interesting one that people often are surprised about, that I've gotten toward myself too. When, especially on the far right, men encounter a powerful woman, they tend to think that she can't possibly be a woman and must secretly be a man or a trans person. And that explains why she is so powerful, because she can't possibly be a woman and have risen to the level that she's at. We see that very frequently. We saw it against Ardern, Harris, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and some of our other targets as well. We also did qualitative research as part of this study, and I did some focus groups with young women as well for the book. And one of the women that we interviewed for the Wilson Center report was she's an online disinformation specialist herself. She's an author, she's a former government official, and she's got quite a presence online. And she said when she deals with abuse online, she often preemptively locks down her account, even when a little bit of it comes in. When she does like a congressional testimony, for instance, she'll lock her account ahead of time because she doesn't want to deal with it. And when it gets really bad, she often just goes silent for several days or even weeks at a time. And she said it's because you don't feel safe to continue speaking, so you don't speak. And we heard this over and over again from our focus group participants. And it's something I understand as well. And sometimes I just don't have the energy, right? I don't have the energy to deal with what's going to come at me. So I don't post that Instagram post. I don't post that tweet. I don't pursue that research or share that article. And I try not to do that because I'm very cognizant of the fact that I'm self-silencing, but also it's extremely emotionally taxing to deal with all of this stuff. And everybody deals with it differently, but I do want to make the point that there is this huge degree of self-censorship. And I think we'll talk about this a little bit in the Q&A, but a lot of people will make a free speech argument about why we need to allow this abuse to just persist on the internet. And I think we already have a censorship problem. It's not of the people who are doing the abuse, it's of the people who are getting abused. So why should we care? I feel like I've already made this point, but online abuse is affecting women and marginalized groups' participation in democracy, in public life, in academia, et cetera. And we need our legislatures and our platforms to stand up for us. We need to stand up for ourselves. Often we kind of suffer in silence with this stuff. People are really surprised whenever I share examples of the abuse that I get on a regular basis. And I think we need to make, again, more of an underline under all of this and say, this is a regular thing that happens, and that's extremely screwed up. All right, so how do we deal with this? Digital security considerations. I'm sure a lot of you already have this stuff in place already, so I'm going to kind of speed through this. But if you don't have two-factor authentication on all of your accounts, please go home and do this today. This means that if your password were to be cracked, or if you're spear phished or something like that, nobody should be able to get into your account, because you will have a second factor of authentication, whether that's a physical security key that you put in your computer, or there are different apps that work as well, where a code is generated, and you have to put that in real time every time you log in. This will make it so that if that password is stolen, you should not have your account compromised. You should be using a password manager. This is kind of a pain in the butt at the beginning, but after you set it up, you really never have to use it again. I mean, you use it, but you don't have to like actively go in there and fix things. You'll have one password that you remember to get into that password manager, and then it will generate for you complex passwords that you'd never be able to remember on your own, and fill them in generally automatically, depending on the browser that you're using. I used to have LastPass up here as one that I recommended, but they recently had a pretty big security breach, so I'm no longer recommending it. They say that everything was encrypted, but if you're on LastPass, this is me included, it's time to kind of move over to another service. If you're doing any travel in dicey areas, I would recommend when you're on public Wi-Fi to be using a VPN. If you're just on your home Wi-Fi all the time, it's not really necessary to be on a VPN. It usually just slows things down. But if you're on an airport Wi-Fi or anywhere else where you think that your internet history might be being spied on, what websites you're accessing, what you're sending to and from, it's great to download a VPN. The best ones are paid, and in fact, a lot of the free ones are trafficking in your data. So just be careful to actually read the terms of service if you're using a free one. Important to use encrypted communications. I know from Alexa that a lot of the defills here are on either WhatsApp or Signal groups together. That is good. Just understand that there are non-encrypted options that kind of have a visage of security. So Telegram and Facebook Messenger have options to encrypt, but you have to turn it on ahead of time. So just be aware of that and make sure that you're either on one of the always encrypted apps, or if you're exchanging really sensitive information, that it's either view once or it expires after some amount of time. Oh, and this is a really important point. Often cloud backup is enabled automatically on all of these apps, so that if your device is stolen or if you're switching between devices, you have your conversation history with all your contacts on there. While that's very convenient, it means that all of your chats are stored somewhere on the cloud. And we've seen, celebrities and their personal information get hacked from iCloud and things like that. So I would just turn this off, frankly. You don't need to remember everything that you said to your best friend and how many cat pictures you sent them 5 years ago, right? So that is important as well. And then I find this a lot with my students in particular. I teach graduate students and undergraduates at Syracuse University. They will often use their Google, like syracuse.edu login or a Facebook login, although that's less frequent with the younger ones especially, but to log into things as kind of a universal login. This is a really dangerous thing to do, because if that account is compromised, everything it's connected to is compromised, right? And you might be thinking, well, what does any of this have to do with disinformation? What does it have to do with gendered abuse? It's that all that personal information can then be used against you. So in my case, when there started to be a lot of interest in me and my personal life, people were talking about how to hack my accounts, how to find if I had any nudes. They wanted to, get to know as much about my personal life as they could. And I had a private security consultant who was kind of searching the dark web for threats against me. But he said to me at one point, if you had not written this book and didn't know as much as you know about online security, things could have been a lot worse for you. So you may not think it's ever going to happen to you, but it's important to consider. And again, once you have it done, you're not going to have to think about it. All right, this is my dog, Jake. He's very cute. So I like to talk about the everyday things that we can all do to make sure that we're being safe. And especially in our ubiquitous social media environments, we tend to just share lots of pictures all the time, and it's great. And we're traveling, and I'm taking beautiful pictures of Oxford. I'm not posting any of them right now. Because I do have people who are, wishing me harm, less in this country, thank goodness. But I don't post anything in real time anymore. I make sure that when I post pictures of my dog or my cat, that their tags are turned inward. In fact, I've just permanently turned them inward on his collar, so I don't have to think about it. I don't share photos of my residence or neighborhood, because that is very easily geolocated. One of the things that my colleagues do will share pictures in Slack sometimes, and they can very easily from the window outside geolocate where we are within seconds. And there are people who maybe aren't as good as that, who could do it within minutes. So especially if you're sharing this stuff in real time, just be really careful about identifying figures, shadows, street signs, etc. Also, I like to note for all of our younger folks here that dating apps are really dangerous for this sort of thing, especially for kind of confidence scams. So if you've gone through a breakup recently and suddenly there's somebody who's taking a ton of interest in your life, and things are progressing really quickly, just slow your roll a little bit, because a lot of social engineering can go on there, and people have had finances taken advantage of, or even violent events happen. So that's just another digital security consideration that's important. When you're traveling, if you're going to sensitive places, I really recommend that you take off facial recognition or fingerprint recognition, because if you're under duress and if you're, detained at a border somewhere, it's very easy to unlock your phone that way and they can go through everything on there. As I said, don't post in real time. This is an example of a very Slavic picture that I took in front of the Eiffel Tower. I would not recommend sharing that in real time. And then when I'm traveling in kind of dicey places, I always establish regular check-ins with friends, family, and colleagues like editors or teammates to make sure that somebody knows where I am at all times and is expecting me back. Also, you can do this with, depending on where you are. I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing this in a place like Russia because often the hotel staff is on the take, but you can establish a check-in with the hotel staff and say, hey, like, I'm here in Myanmar and I am going to come back, within 2 hours. And if I'm not, can you please call this number? Something like that. And obviously all of this is for academics, for freelancers, for organizations that don't necessarily have the security structure to be worrying about you in all those situations. All right, so that's the serious stuff. Let's talk about trolls. Trolls, what do trolls want? They are benefiting from your engagement with them. They want to be amplified. They want oxygen from you. They want to enjoy interacting with you, even if it seems like they hate you or they're being aggressive. Something I often have to remind myself when there's just like an annoying dude replying to me and I look and he has 6 followers, like he gets more even if I burn him in the reply than if I don't engage with him, right? So people are going to see that more. He might even gain a few followers. So I like to remind myself about that. They are also trying to silence you, right? They're trying to embarrass you, to shame you. They want you not to speak. I think it's important to sometimes just turn off notifications. We'll talk about safety mode on Twitter in a little bit. This just makes it so you see less of the garbage on there. But don't let them take away your voice, right? They're just angry people on the internet, so ignore them. Sometimes they might want to elicit your personal information. So they might ask you personal questions. This can allow them to crack some of your password questions. So like, oh, where did you grow up? Where did you go to school? What was your debate club name? All those sorts of things that your bank asks you when you're setting up an account. Just be wary of sharing that sort of stuff online, either with trolls or broadly as well. I'm not sure why this slide is where it is in the presentation.
Lots of trolls coming in.
Yes. This is what dogpiling looks like. Thank you, Alexa. She knows me better than I know myself sometimes. All right, so Alexa did this lovely visualization. The blue and green are the sexualized and racist terms. I just included that because it's quite interesting. But I love this visualization because it really visualizes what it feels like to be at the center of a bunch of trolls, just like we were talking about before, like people who are coming in, most of them coming in one at a time, right? But there are some who are coming in multiple times. It's like being in a swarm of bees and not being able to get them off of you. Or I also like the visualization, if you know Charlie Brown, Pigpen, the little guy who has a cloud of dirt around him all the time. That's what that feels like. And sometimes you just need to turn it off, whether that's blocking people, whether that is disengaging from the platform for a little bit. But I love this visualization. So thank you, Alexa, for doing that beautiful thing. I also like to make fun of the trolls. So here's the typology that I usually deal with, the 5 main categories. We've got reply guys. Sometimes they can be kind of, nice seeming, but they're usually credentialed lawyers, professors, etc., who like to think that they're better than you for some reason, especially for women. This often happens. I'll engage with them once or twice, and if they just want to make one up me constantly, then I disengage with them and mute them. Muting is great because then they just shout into the void forever and you don't have to worry about it after that. Trojan Horse. This is a guy who, this is a really sad one for me because I really like engaging with people online, and especially if they'll send me a nice message and say, oh, I really liked your talk at OII that I live streamed. I'll say thanks. I've had to stop doing that because from there, things can get really creepy. Some guys started sending me voice memos and I was afraid to listen to them. Sometimes they'll send you unwanted images. You can imagine what's in there. Sometimes they just expect your attention. So I remember I was having a nice conversation with one guy and I was like, well, I've got to go cook dinner now. And he was like, okay, fine, be that way, stuff like that. So I've just had to totally disengage with this sort of thing. And I make it very clear on my profiles that like, if you want to engage with me for something professional, you have to email me because I can't have open DMs anymore, or this is what happens. We have the guys who can't seem to use Google. They don't know, I'll say something, there's an example on a slide that's coming up about swatting, and a guy didn't know what swatting was. Or sometimes they'll just ask, what is swatting? Swatting is when you call a SWAT team on someone as a form of abuse after they've been doxxed. Don't let them use you as Google. Like, that's not your job. Dwight Dooley 1936 at hotmail.com is the old men, the collective old men who write to me in all caps. There are more of them than you think. They are, especially after TV appearances, I get these guys writing to me. And then we've got, your typical anti-feminist Frank, the online misogynist who thinks that women should just go back to the kitchen and make them a sandwich. So all of these guys, I mean, we can laugh about it. Again, when you're dealing with it at a large scale, it can be pretty overwhelming. But I like to make fun of them because, again, trolls are a strategy. Trolls are a thing to be managed, not solved. Like I said, the most economical response is to mute and move on. And the reason that Daenerys Targaryen is here is that especially once you've gotten a large following, you don't want to bomb the village. You don't want to pull a Daenerys last season of Game of Thrones and burn everything down. Sorry if that's a spoiler for anybody. My friend Van Badham, who's a columnist for The Guardian in Australia, and she's also a playwright. She's dealt with a ton of abuse. I interview her in the book. She says, don't bomb the village. There's a psychological payoff to swatting a fly, but to the outside, it looks really bad, right? It looks like you, the person with, lots of followers and clout or whatever, even if you don't have that many followers, even if you're just, an Oxford academic, right? It looks like you're just being a jerk. And we don't want to further that cycle of abuse. So what do? What I love to do is either block them, and you can use middleware like Block Party for this. Block Party is an app that you allow access to your account, and it will block accounts for you that are engaging in abusive behavior. Basically, you can also block any account that's interacted with an abusive tweet. So in my case, I have very high follower influencers who say horrible things about me, and I can put that tweet in there and Block Party will block or mute literally everyone who's ever interacted with that tweet. So that means I've blocked over 500,000 people on Twitter. The app is a much nicer place now that I've done that, and I resisted doing it for a long time. Some people are really mad that they've been blocked even though they've never interacted with me. I don't care. Like, and I'll say this again later just to remind you, your timeline is not a democracy. These tools exist for a reason, and they're there to keep you safe and allow you to enjoy your experience on the platform. So there's that, but there's also the ability that you have to deny influence and notoriety. So what do? I take a screenshot. So this is me announcing that this book was going to be published in 2021. And there's a guy that's saying like, it's not dangerous to be a woman on the internet. And I'm like, you're an idiot. And I took away his avatar and his screen name. And I talked about, here's why you're wrong, and put the cute emoji. This does a couple of things, right? Denies him influence and notoriety. It also means that my followers are learning about the types of things that I get regularly. And it allows me to make a point. It also stops that cycle of abuse that I mentioned before. So this is what I like to do. I don't always have the energy to do it. And sometimes people will still go and search the text of the tweet and try to, fight back. I don't encourage them to do it, but there's at least more steps involved there. My favorite little dunk that I've ever done was around this time last year. So I was in my second trimester of pregnancy. The war in Ukraine was about to begin. I was launching a big research project, about to start my government job, not sleeping a whole lot because I was doing constant media hits about Ukraine. I'm really worried about Ukraine, and I was also pregnant. And a man wrote me an email that said something like, I just saw you on BBC. I wanted to let you know that you look unwell. You have really big bags under your eyes, and you know, maybe it's just the lighting, but I wanted to let you know in case it's a health problem. Like, thank you. And so I took a screenshot of the email, obviously didn't include his email address, and I said, you know, maybe it's that I'm in my 6th month of pregnancy. Maybe it's that there's a war happening in the country that I lived in and loved, or maybe it's Maybelline. I thought that was pretty good. Okay, speaking of which, I also get a lot of abuse on email, especially academics. This happens a lot to my friends in academia. I highly, highly recommend, if you haven't done this already, to separate your work and personal email accounts. As somebody who's basically a freelancer, I made the mistake a long time ago of making my personal and work account the same. I'm trying to separate them now, but it's really hard to figure out how to get the Groupon emails and everything else to go somewhere else. And also, like, press have my email now. So like redirecting that is a pain. I suggest you do it now. You can use filters to filter out the unknown people to a separate inbox, so you don't have to see that stuff. You can have somebody else, if you have an assistant at some point in your glory future, check that for you. All of that is a good strategy to not seeing that stuff as it's coming in and having it interrupt your day as you go through. On Gmail, you can report abusive account holders who are sending you things. If they're coming from another email service, you won't be able to. But I was pleased that this happened. It was as I was researching the book that this happened, and until then, there was no way to report that sort of stuff. And again, your social media profiles are not a democracy. They are your kingdom. Treat them that way. All right, so platform policy. I know I'm running a little bit long here, but really important for you to use the tools that platforms offer you to your advantage. I know it feels like we report things, they go nowhere. Just with our Myanmar report that I mentioned before, we even had a meeting with some of the platforms and they said, well, you should just report it on the platform. Why are you talking to us here, right? And that's frustrating, but what reporting allows you to do is send signals to the platforms. They use this information on the back end to understand the threat landscape there. And if they see that one person is sending the word fart 400 times in a day, they might, you know, take them down for spam or something like that. And especially if they're doing worse things, that gives them really important data. It's also really important to understand the terms of service that the platforms have, so that when they're doing something that is wrong, you have them dead to rights, as one of my interlocutors in the book said. So for instance, on Twitter, dead naming, where you use a trans person's previous name, that is not allowed explicitly in Twitter's terms of service. So if you know that and you can push it forward, it's much more likely to get taken down. There are also increasing amounts of on-platform features that can make your online experience better. So Twitter introduced safety mode, which will auto block accounts that use harmful language or send repetitive replies. You can also just mute certain words, mute keywords. This is really important. You can also hand over your phone and have somebody deal with your account for you, which is what I did when the height of the disinformation governance board situation was happening, because I couldn't keep up with it. I didn't want to look at it, and I needed to block those people as soon as possible, or at least mute them. All right, this slide, hopefully none of you ever have to deal with this. In retrospect, I wish I had been a little bit better about this, even though I wrote pages about it in my book. I didn't do this when it was happening to me, and I've recently had to take out a restraining order against one of my cyber stalkers, and I'm involved in some other legal litigation about, legal litigation is a bit repetitive, litigation about things that are happening to me online. And it is difficult to retroactively find the evidence. Sometimes these things have been taken down, right? So you want to have screenshots, you want to have all that evidence if you're going to go to law enforcement, or if you need it for some other type of engagement. So there are ways that you can do this. Hunchly and Page Vault are two paid apps. Unfortunately, they are paid. That basically, this is helpful for open source investigators as well. As you're browsing online, it will just take screenshots of everything that you are looking at. So if you're down a rabbit hole, it will take all the screenshots, the metadata, etc. Page Vault is something that lawyers use when they're doing online investigations. It's court admissible evidence. But this will help you if you need to go to the police, if you need to go to a lawyer and say, I need a restraining order, I need an injunction, I need to, launch a civil suit. It took me a long time to get to the point where I went to law enforcement to open a case file against one of my more persistent harassers and to get into litigation about all of this stuff, because it is extremely time consuming and cumbersome and often doesn't lead to anything. But I really believe that as a white woman with some degree of means, I have a duty to do this stuff, because it means that law enforcement are more exposed to the problem, hopefully making them more likely to act on it in the future. And also we're kind of paving a path forward, right, for the people who come after us. And so I don't know if any of the litigation that I'm involved in right now is going to end positively for me, but I have filed the police reports. I am making the point. When I'm hauled up before Congress in a couple of weeks, I'll be able to say, I've had to open this protective order against a man who has been cyber stalking me for the past 8 months. This is the reality of life. And hopefully that'll also, trigger something with our legislators that they need to change the legal infrastructure. And there are very few countries, I think Australia is one of the only ones that has a good online safety system. I know our online safety bill in the UK is still under consideration. It's a huge gap because right now all we have to rely on is the platforms for their help. And in that vein, it's really important to build community. So one of the reasons that I report all that stuff is for the people who come after me, the young women that I mentor. You got to lean on your friends and family on and offline. They might not understand what you're going through, but it's hugely important to kind of take them through it. A lot of my friends and family, including my mom and my husband, at first didn't understand what I was going through and thought, it's just don't look at the comments. It's really hard not to look at the comments, right? Especially when you're an online researcher and this is your life. So I recommend making explicit asks for support, not just like, well, actually, you can say, I just need to vent right now. I don't need you to solve this problem for me. I just need to talk at you. Or like, I don't want to think about it. Can we go to the movies? Can we go make s'mores? Can we do something like that, right? You want to get your mind off it. They won't know how to help you because it's so overwhelming. And then also, it's really important that we're all active online bystanders. So if we see something happening, we report it. We, tell that person that their behavior is not okay. We follow and engage with women and marginalized people to amplify their voices. Did you know that men are retweeted twice as often as women on Twitter, and Reddit's user base is only 30% women? I mean, there's a reason why, right? So making sure that we're amplifying people. And when you're seeing harassment, sending somebody a message of support can be the difference between them, getting out of bed that day and staying in and not looking at their phone ever again. Very quickly, I've mentioned organizations have a real responsibility here as well. I did not receive support from the Biden administration when I was in, and that was a big consideration in my leaving. Because I felt like, they hired me to do this role and then they let me twist in the wind. And there's not a lot of consideration among academic institutions, among newsrooms and other public facing organizations about what is becoming a reality of life online. So as you are going into the workforce, I really encourage you to ask about support policies for this stuff when you're entering a job. Ask about what happens if I get doxxed. Are you going to send me and my family to not a safe house, but another location? Are you going to pay for, psychological help or legal help for me if this situation is happening? And make sure you tell your employer or your academic institution if this stuff is happening related to your work. I've done that before and it hasn't always worked, not only with the Biden administration, but other jobs I've had where I've said, here's this abuse I'm getting. What are we going to do about it? And they just say, we're so sorry. And that's the end of the support that they offer. But changing that does start with a new generation, making them realize that this is the reality of the situation. And also, I know therapy is not therapy has kind of a bad rep in the UK sometimes. One of my British friends says, "Why do I want to pay someone to listen to me whinge?" But I do encourage it. If you're going through online abuse, without my therapist, I would be in a bad spot. And yes, I am paying her to listen to me whinge, but at least I know that there is someone there to listen and understands kind of the full gravity of what I've been going through. And I don't know why that got cut off. All of this is so that we can build a better community in the future, right? It's not just about you and what you're going through. For me, the only thing that keeps me really going through all this difficult stuff that I've been dealing with is the fact that I'm hopefully making the world better for everybody who comes after me. So the internet is a critical public space for our free expression right now, for politics, for activism. And until everybody there can feel safe to express themselves, nobody's safe. It's kind of a twist on the very famous quote, you know, until everyone is free, nobody's free. And I really do believe that with the internet. So I'm going to stop there. Alexa is going to moderate what is unfortunately a rather short Q&A, but I have time to stick around afterwards. So I think you're supposed to come up and look at the questions online, and I'll just move over here and take a swig of water.
Well,
So
thank you so much, Nina. Thank you. Does anyone in the room have a question or comment first before I start looking at the questions we got online? Lisa.
I'm sorry, I listened to all of your talk, but I started online until I was able to come physically. Sorry about that. I'm focusing my study on the situation around Russia, Ukraine, Belarus. I'm very interested in these countries, and I came up with maybe random questions, but maybe you observed that online abuse was specifically targeted against Ukrainian women when it comes from Russian side. Did you may you comment on that?
Yeah, so I definitely saw that with Svetlana Zalishchuk. I think Alexa is going to be looking at this in her PhD a little bit more in political communication and the ways that gender intersects with all of that. Interestingly, I've seen a lot of it in Belarus as well, around Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the woman who won the presidential election, for those that might not be familiar with Belarus, but is kind of serving now as de facto president in exile, while Alexander Lukashenko has kind of maintained the actual presidency. But she and the women in white who led the protest movement against Lukashenko in 2020 faced a lot of online abuse.
So both in Belarus and Ukraine, women are targeted specifically for their political activity, right?
Well, political activity, yeah, I think so. I think Russia understands very specifically that women are an important, a critical, a necessary component to a successful democracy. And so by undermining democratically active women, they're undermining democratic movements. And I think that's why we see women like Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, like Zalishchuk in Ukraine, like the Georgian women who I mentioned before, who were targeted with these sex tapes. They recognize that by undermining women, they undermine democracy. Thanks for coming.
And then, good.
Yeah. So I've done a lot of research about like non-consensual sharing of private sexual images and videos, but I'm also interested in like knowing if you had like any approach to kind of like these online movements regarding like women's rights, such as like the Me Too maybe, or like if you have like any comment on these, especially because I've experienced it myself, but I also know some people that have been like very active on social media, kind of like giving their support to this, and then it comes like I'm not feeling safe enough in order like to continue talking, or I identified when I used to live in Mexico City, like I wouldn't post anything about like my daily life until like maybe 2 weeks after. That also led to the sense that I didn't feel that I was being like very active still, like to give support to that movement. So when like the abortion rights protests came, or like the Me Too movement came, we were like receiving a lot of hate and everything. But like I would like to know if you have had like any experience like doing research on these topics, and not even like how to deal, but like how these gets affected with like the violence you receive, but at the same time like to deal with how can the movement still like go forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a really delicate balance. So it makes me think of the Hong Kong protests and actually what's happening in Afghanistan right now, or Iran even. Women and other people who are protesting and being active against authoritarian regimes or certain policy decisions that are being made and posting about it online often become targets of offline violence. The authorities can then use all those images and video to identify who people are and where they are, and then use that to arrest them. So it's a really delicate balance. And for me, so because of my baby and because of kind of those safety threats, I haven't been super active in like protest movements recently. We had kind of the Black Lives Matter marches in DC in 2020 and 2021, and there wasn't as much attention on me then. So I like very happily posted from them. Now I would not do that. I've gotten to a point where, unfortunately, even in Washington, which is a fairly liberal city, people recognize me on the street and will post pictures of me non-consensually, kind of outing where I am at that point. Or, I'm very hesitant now to even post. If this weren't in the UK, I probably wouldn't have amplified the fact that I were coming here today, because I'm afraid of people showing up that I don't want there. And so it's a really delicate balance, and I definitely do feel somewhat silenced, but I guess everyone has to kind of make that decision for themselves. And I can't really prescribe, because everybody's personal situation is different, and how you behave in Mexico City is very different from how somebody in Oxford would behave as well. So just taking into account kind of the contextual situation, the safety considerations from particular regimes or governments, and your own kind of personal level of safety. Another friend of mine, actually one of the same women who was in our focus group, she doesn't even share where she lives. Like, people still think she lives in Washington, but she doesn't live there anymore, which gives her a certain degree of anonymity in her daily life, which frankly sounds quite appealing to me right now.
So we've got some questions online. So we've got two. So I'll ask one and then see if there's any other in-person ones. So Nina, you mentioned that 95% of deepfakes online are sexually abusive against women. This colleague online does not use social media anymore, but they suspect that there's a spread of this on platforms. So it's not just the existence of the videos, but that they make their way, and they're disseminated. So what are platforms and companies doing to counter this? So specifically the kind of spread of video-based abuse, and anything question mark?
Not as much as they should be. So most of the platforms have direct, explicit policies against sharing deepfakes, whether those are non-consensual pornographic deepfakes or just deepfakes in general. It is a little easier for the platforms to detect this sort of AI generated content, but they're not always great at it. And in general, I would say image-based abuse is something that the platforms could do a lot more with. So we know that with terrorist content or other disinformative or harmful content, there's something called the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, the GIFCT, or GIFCT, depending on how you pronounce. I like GIF, but and so this is a coalition where tech companies have come together and they've created a hash tracking database. So an image has a special hash behind it. You can then use that hash to search that image no matter what platform it is on. This allows them to identify that harmful content and take it down en masse from all platforms. Now, there are ways to get around this. We saw when the Christchurch shooting happened that people who were sharing that video were editing it. So either, cropping it, changing the saturation on it, speeding it up, slowing it down. That creates a different hash, right? So they're able to get around it in that way. The platforms aren't doing enough about any of this stuff, but especially for some reason with this sexualized content, particularly when it's targeting women, there's just not a lot of political will. And I hate to say it, but I do think it is exigent, it is beneficial, it is profitable for the platforms to allow this content to proliferate to some degree. When we have, child sexual exploitation material, they take that stuff down right away. They use similar technology to do all of it. But, when it's against adult women, we often don't see similar political will to get that done. So this is why I do the research that I do. I speak out. about the experiences that I've had reporting content, and hopefully we can continue to pressure the platforms to do their due diligence and duty of care for the women users that they have.
I'll ask one more quick question that I got from my friend Francesca. So she says, thank you for the amazing talk. How should law enforcement change in order to protect women better, in order to sanction those who create and distribute gender abuse online? So legally, what would a safe online world look like in your view? And it's got to follow, and I don't know if it's the same stream, but safe online world legally. And is there research on how much gender abuse online is actually distributed by real people or bots? So that is a separate question.
Okay, law enforcement. Well, I think we need a lot of education first about law enforcement or for law enforcement. So obviously the situation in the States is a little bit different, but I would imagine it's there are some similarities, at least in terms of understanding and awareness among the law enforcement here in the UK or other countries. When I filed my protective order recently, I first opened a police report against my cyber stalker, and the detective called me up and he said, first, he didn't really understand what my police report was about. And I'm like, well, I've given you pages of content, so like you could just look at it. But and then he's like, well, you know, you could file a protective order if you want, but it won't do anything because he's in a different state. So they are not able to extradite him if he violates the protective order by contacting me. The only thing they can do is if he shows up to my house, then they can arrest him, or if he shows up within 100 feet of me, I can call emergency services and they'll arrest him, which gives me peace of mind, right? Because this is a guy who has a history of doing this sort of thing. He did not understand that you know, having that lever was something really important for me and my family. He was like, yeah, I don't really recommend that you file the order. And discouraging a target of abuse from doing that sort of thing. I mean, you wouldn't say to a woman who is dealing with a real stalker in person, don't file a protective order against the stalker, just because he's, you know, 3 hours north of me in New York City instead of in Washington, D.C. doesn't make me sleep better at night, right? And so we need awareness building, but I also think we need to update our legal code more broadly. And I say this for almost every country except for Australia, so that there are consequences for online abusers. In Australia, if you look up the e-safety commissioner, I'm sure some of you will be really interested in the work that they do. They've got a special office that deals with, you know, child sexual abuse material, but they also deal with online abuse, hate speech, harassment, etc. And there are consequences when Australians abuse each other online. It's like something like a $70,000 fine for sustained online harassment. And that, I think, it hasn't solved the problem yet. But the fact that there is a consequence there means that it's not just the platforms that have to respond to the commissioner, but there's also a legal lever that people can pull if necessary. And I met with the commissioner. She's actually an American woman who used to work for Microsoft and Twitter. So really strong background in technology. And she said to me, you know, for what happened with you, you would absolutely have a case against multiple individuals. And I think that's huge. So right now, as I mentioned before, the online safety bill doesn't include gender as a protected characteristic. There is a petition that's being filed by Glitch UK. If you're interested in signing that, that's available to you. And it is potentially introducing fines for platforms for not taking down material that is explicitly prohibited by their terms of service. But I also think we need to think about individual responsibility in all of this, because right now, again, there's no consequence for people doing this. They think it's just fun. They think it has no effect, or much more maliciously, they think the effect is something that they want, which is shutting people up and specifically shutting women up. So thinking about how to do that, it's a delicate balance. Yes, I recognize that, but it's really important. And the second question was about bots and real people. So we found in our Wilson Center study that most of this was real people. Most of them were people who just like to abuse other people online. I've got a couple of reply guys who tell me over and over again, all we need to do is introduce real ID. If we get rid of, anonymous accounts, abuse will go away. Well, I've received abuse on LinkedIn. So I really don't think that that is true. I think some people are really proud of the abuse that they do, including my cyber stalker. He signs his emails with his name, phone number, and address, which is one of the reasons I was able to get a protective order against him, because I know who he is. He's not just an anonymous person on the internet. So I don't think a lot of it is bots. It is possible to use the bots, but you can usually tell when something is inauthentic and coordinated in that way. It almost makes it, in fact, I do think it's worse, because you're dealing with real people who are just absolutely forgetting that you're a human on the other side of the screen. And that was what just kind of tying it all together was most difficult for me when I still go through the abusive stuff that I've dealt with as a result of my appointment to the Biden administration. I mean, I was at the most vulnerable part of my life, right? I was about to give birth. I was a blimp. I did not feel great about how I looked. People were dissecting my appearance. People were saying, how could somebody get her pregnant? People were calling my child demon spawn, my unborn child. People were saying like I would probably abort my child when I was giving birth, like all sorts of horrible things, right? Because I was a caricature to them. I wasn't a real person. And that was created in part by the online environment and in part by the political environment in the United States. But I think we all need to remember the humans on the other side of the avatar. And, you know, the more that we can be active online bystanders and create, you know, a more positive environment online, the better. It costs us nothing to be nice. That's something I like to remind people very often. So with that, thank you so much for your questions. I'm sorry I yammered on so long. And thanks for coming today. Thanks to Oxford for hosting me.
Thank you, Nina. Thanks so much.
All right.
Do we